All right, let me share my screen. Not that one. Okay. And let me bring up the chat. Okay, there we go. Okay. All right, welcome everyone. Let's see, we are wrapping up week number 7 for our database course. And the halfway point of the course, you should be focusing right now on completing your midterm exam, which was made available earlier today, and will be available all through the weekend till Monday at midnight. I did run a poll on see how folks wanted to do it, either Friday to Sunday or Saturday to Monday, and it was evenly split. So I decided to just extend the day so that it's available today all the way to Monday at midnight. It's a little shorter than I expected. It was challenging creating many versions of the same question, randomizing them, and making sure that they were consistent and everybody was getting more or less the same type of questions. So I think the 3 hours, 2 or 3 hours that I gave should be plenty to complete. And it is very, very similar to the review that we went over on earlier this week, as well as many of the questions that you've already seen in the quiz. So if you feel comfortable with those questions, you should feel absolutely comfortable as well in the midterm. Also, there's no assignment this week, right? So to give you a chance to just focus on the midterm, we will pick up the cadence of 1 assignment per week. Again, next Tuesday, next time we meet, we will get started on assignments again. For today, we're just going to wrap up some of the technology that we introduced late last week. Right, we talked about how to integrate with databases using Jdbc. We had been discussing in how to program the database, and we talked about functions, we talked about stored procedures and triggers, and like any programming, we have to learn perhaps a new language, a new syntax. With stored procedures, we need to learn about how to create them within the database, right? All the ways that we can pass parameters to them, all the syntax of creating of if statements and looping, and obviously integrated with all sorts of SQL commands that you can embed inside of your functions and your stored procedures. And every language or every new programming mechanism is just new tools that we learn, and they all have their idiosyncrasies. They all have their own specific things that you need to learn, little quirks on how it works on one language, on one infrastructure, on one particular technology and whatnot, right? But yeah, I mean that's what we do as software engineers, right? We pick up many different languages and tools, and they all become part of our toolbox, and we use them depending on the case. So stored procedures and functions, right? That's how as close as you can get, when you're programming a database. That's as close as you can get to the actual database, right? And creating some executable code, right, that interacts with that database. Now we started introducing a new way or an alternative or an additional way of programming the database, but from outside of the database. Right? We introduced Java, Jdbc last week, and of course, like any other programming language, it has its own quirks, its syntax. There's a question here in the chat. Would you recommend installing IntelliJ for this course in particular, or would other IDEs like Eclipse be okay? Yeah, we'll talk about IDEs, but yeah, I would certainly encourage you to learn about IntelliJ. It's a very powerful tool, not only IntelliJ, but there's a whole plethora of tools in the that in addition to IntelliJ for connected to databases and whatnot, and programming in all different languages, not only Java, but Python or any other language. And they're very, very powerful. They're free for students. If you use your Northeastern EDU email, right, you'll get at least 1 year free, right? And you'll be able to renew from there on. And me, as a faculty, every year I renew my license, and it's been free for several years. And it's definitely a great tool to pick up. It's widely used in industry, and you should definitely feel comfortable with it. If you prefer Eclipse, that's totally fine as well. Or if you prefer code, from Microsoft, or if you just want to use a notepad, that's fine. Certainly, if you use Eclipse or one of these more powerful IDEs, there's a lot of plumbing, a lot of configuration that is already done for you, so that you don't have to do that manually. So the IDE will certainly make it easier for you. It will parse these types of projects, and will pick up, and install several plugins that otherwise you would have to do that manually on your own. So definitely, I encourage you to to start using one of these IDEs. IntelliJ, definitely, I'm going to be using IntelliJ, and I certainly encourage folks to use it as well. So yeah, right. So we're gonna be spending some time today, wrapping up some of that topic that we introduced late last week. We'll continue implementing a couple things that we had started, and just move forward. And we are going to be using Jdbc. Jdbc is a fairly low level programming API that it's as close as you can get to the actual database, but not actually running in the database, right? Basically, it allows you to do what Workbench does, right? Is you can programmatically create a connection, and then it allows you to take a SQL and send it to the database server for execution, and then whatever the database comes back with as a result set, either with multiple rows or a single row, right? You can then consume and iterate over those rows and process them, maybe just creating instances in memory, from those rows that come from the database, right? So those steps are almost always the same, regardless on what language you end up actually using. You first do a connection, you send a SQL statement for execution on the server, and then you process the result set, right? And those are very, very, very common across the board. Whatever language you pick up, whatever infrastructure you end up using, right? So whatever you learn here using Jdbc is definitely transferable to other programming languages. In all cases, the challenge is to try and map these two different worlds that are very distinct, right? In the relational world, right, or just storage, database storage in general, right? You are talking about lots and lots of data, right? That is permanently stored in a file system, right, for long-term storage, right? And the database gives you the capability of being able to manage this massive amounts of data that is always present there in the file system that is stored. And we're trying to map this massive data into an in-memory representation that you represent with objects that are instances of classes that are being stored temporarily in RAM in a machine that is running in a very small environment, right? So we're trying to map this massive amount of data to this rinky-dinky small little piece that is only a temporary copy, right? A cache of whatever the real data is in the relational database. And so as an application, you need to be able to connect, right? Copy some of that data that is in a relational database, represent it in memory, right? And because you're going to represent some user interface so folks can interact with it, right? And as they click and drag and type whatever, you then go back and re-update that state permanent in the database, right? So this is the big challenge is how to map these two worlds, right? The relational world, right, using relational models with create statements, right, SQL and whatnot, and map it to the object world, the object-oriented world that is about classes and objects and methods, right? And how is it that we bridge these two worlds? And that's what we're using with Jdbc. Jdbc is it's a very low-level API that we're going to revisit next week. We'll introduce a much higher level API that allows you to somewhat forget about SQL, right? It hides all those detailed implementation so that you don't have to write SQL. So we'll be writing still SQL today, and next week we're going to create a layer of abstraction on top of that, so that from the object world you want to be able to think about your application in terms of classes and objects. And the fact that you're using rows and tables and whatnot as a storage solution, right? That's secondary, right? And so, how is it that you bridge those two worlds? It'll be the topic of next week. This week we're still going to be spending some more time with Jdbc. We'll also talk about today on how is it that this data that is permanently stored in the database, right? And we can certainly write an application to talk to it. How that data can not only serve the purposes of a specific application, but it could serve so much more, right? That if we could expose that data and share it with the rest of the world, that data goes from having a the value of that data now becomes exponentially important, right? Exponentially valuable, right? As more folks can use that data and integrate with that data, without having to log in or go through hoops to get at that data, right? And obviously we can create the the safety mechanisms for making sure that data is private and only the persons who are supposed to get certain data only get that data, of course. But trying to find those mechanisms that make it easier for folks to exchange data and increment the value of our database. Okay, so yeah, so that's all coming up, and that's the topic for today and for the next couple of weeks. All right, and we'll get to it right now. Before we get started, any questions?
I have two more related to the test and Java. I know that we're still covering it today. I just want to confirm that is going to be on the test, right?
Java, no, not on this test.
Oh, lovely. That's great news.
No Java at all for this. Yeah, it only goes up to functional store procedures and functions up to that point. Not triggers either. No triggers for the exam either.
Lovely, thank you. And then my last question was just also referring to the test. I know in the practice exam, you gave us, there were some places where we would have to type in code. For those, are there going to be specified ways we need to type it, similar to how we have to do it on the quiz?
Yeah, you won't have to type anything.
Oh, cool. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Other than the fill in the blanks that you've seen already in the previous quizzes, but nothing more complicated than that. No cool. Free form, nothing free form.
Cool, thank you.
All right. Okay, so let's move on. Let's take a look at let's recap what we worked on late last week, and then go on from there. Right? Okay, so I have packaged the source code from the sample code that we played around with last week, and I made a repository in GitHub that you can access here. So if you go to modules in your canvas, you'll get the hyperlink here. So here in Java Git repository, if you open that in a new tab, right, it takes you to the Java repository. So this is the source code that we played around with last week. A little bit cleaned up and massaged, right? But it's mostly what we played around with, right? So we had, if we go into the source code, most of the code is in here in main, and under here, template here. And if you remember, we created a Java class that was called blog, and it is a Java. It's a class like any other class that you would implement in any language, right? Whether this is Java, right? It's you name the class, and you have several class variables that you provide some primitive data types such as integers, strings, and dates and whatnot. And then you provide setters and getters to mutate the data, or to read the data, or write the data into the object, right? So, so the challenge, right, is that we want to be able to map the data that is stored in relational databases as rows, records, and tables. We want to map those records, right, to instances of this object, right? And we could already see some extrapolation here that in the relational database, right, we have fields that have, I believe it has the exact same names, you know, ID, name, topic, and whatnot. And in the relational database, we have int, varchar, right, tinyint, blah blah blah, all those data types. And the challenge here is to convert them into data types that are appropriate for your specific language, right, whatever language that might be. Here we are using integers, strings, timestamps, and whatnot, right, to map them into this object data model, right? So we represent here in the object world, we implement this object model, and in the relational world, we use the relational model, right? And in the relational model, we create the structure of the data using the create statement, create table, and then we list all the fields and their data types and the default values, blah, 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 right? Whereas in Java or in object-oriented world, right, we use classes, right, with their own properties and their data types and whatnot, right? And we're looking to bridge these two worlds, right? And the way we bridged it was using a DAO, right? DAOs, we said that the DAOs were data access object, right, that are encapsulate, right, all the nuances, right, all the details, all the minutia of how is it that we bridge these two worlds, right? So that you encode here all the details about getting, connecting to the database and sending data or retrieving data or updating data, removing data, right? And all the details and idiosyncrasies are embedded and encapsulated in the DAO, so that the rest of the application, right, can forget about those details and just use the DAO and go through a well-defined API, a set of functions that know what to do, of how to retrieve all the blogs, or how to create a blog, or how to delete a blog, right, or how to update a blog. So these DAOs encapsulate all the mechanisms that know how to talk to a database, so that the rest of the application doesn't, right? Now, for now, the application is represented by this rinky-dinky main function, right? That is creating an instance of the DAO, and then it's using it for retrieving and doing some really, really simple stuff, right? So we're going to expand more on this. So we're going to revisit this example and implement the remainder parts of this, right? And see what's beyond just the DAO. Okay. All right. Any questions of where we are so far? All right, so you can get a hold of this source code, right, by following the hyperlink here in Java Git repository, and then you can download it in several ways. Perhaps one of the easiest ways that you can do is to just download a zip file. Over here, just hit download zip, and you can unzip it. Now, the more professional way of doing this is that you copy the URL, right? You copy the URL, and then at the terminal or console, right, you use the tool Git, right? Git is a very, very popular, very well-known and extended use in industry for source control, right? That is one of the main ways that software engineers share code amongst each other, right? They put it in a repository, and folks can then clone down, make changes, and then push any changes, and then folks can take a look at it and accept or not accept those changes, and they can review it and whatnot, and they can code review that and agree on what is the ultimate result. Sorry. We're not going to go as far as that, but at least it'll be a mechanism that for which we can share code back and forth. Okay. So I'm going to clone down the repository. Let's see, where are we? So we're going to go into NEU and 2020, and then we'll go to Spring. And let's go to CS3200. And here we're going to clone that, right? We're going to say clear. We'll clone that. We'll say git clone, and then the URL that I copied from that repository. Okay, so when I do that, right, it copies down the code and it creates a directory. This directory creates a directory just with the name of the repository. Okay, so I'm going to say CD, go in there, and my source code is here, right? So now I have that source code. You could have just downloaded the zip file and unzipped it into this directory. Same thing. Well, not quite the same, right? This one at least is tied to the repository. Any changes I make here, I can push those changes up to the repository so folks can use it. All right, so let's now open this up with my favorite IDE. So I'll bring up Intellij. And I'll say open, and I'll navigate to the directory we just created. It's inside of Januzzi, inside of NEU, 2021, Spring 3200, and then the directory we just created, it's this one right here. We'll say open. Okay, so the IDE is parsing the project and identifying what type of project it is, and installing any plugins, updating itself, and making it easier for me to navigate this content. So if you go into the source directory, this is where we're going to spend most of our time, in the source directory. Instead of main, Java. Most of the work that we worked on last time around was under the blog, the models blog, and then the DAO down here. Yes? And so this is the blog object data model that we implemented late last week. Right? And here's the blog that interacts with the database and fetches data, right? So let's review where we are, and let's make a plan on how to move forward. Okay, so we have here the blog DAO declares some constants on what driver are we going to be using, whether we're using Oracle or SQL Server or MySQL. Here we're using the MySQL driver, right? That is going to implement the Jdbc API, right? The way it works is that the Jdbc API is fairly simple. It has, 3 main interfaces. Well, it's got tons of other interfaces. This is a cooler. This is like the Matrix. Okay. So the interface, Jdbc interface, declares 3 main interfaces. it declares many other, but three are the main ones, right? The connection interface, right? The statement interface, and the result set, right? Connection allows you to establish a connection to a remote database anywhere in the world, as long as you know their IP address or their URL, you can connect to any database. And as long as you have a username and password access, the database could be, running halfway across the world, and you can connect to it and just no problem. So yeah, so those are the three. Then statement allows you to execute either a query, a select statement, or an update, an insert, update, or delete, right? You can send SQL back and forth to the server, and then the server might respond, right? If you're doing a query, it might respond with rows or records that meet your select criteria, and then allows you to iterate or process the results that come back from the server. So basically, those are the three main interfaces that we are mostly interested in, right? Then MySQL or Oracle or any of these competing vendors, right? They implement their own driver, right? That implements those three interfaces. Plus, but we are insulated from the actual driver, right? We're insulated from the idiosyncrasies of how they are implemented by each vendor, because our code is always compiled against the Jdbc interfaces, which are implemented by these vendors, right? So they might implement them differently, but we don't care, right? Because all our code is using the interfaces and the methods and the functions that are declared in those interfaces, right? As long as the vendors implement that interface, we're good. We can use any vendor. Here is the URL to where our server is running. Currently, it's running locally on my machine, but this could be, if you know the IP address or the URL of this server running, somewhere in Eastern Europe, and you know their URL, you can just paste that here, right? And you know the port, and perhaps also the database schema that is being used remotely. And this is what is called a connection string, right? That just builds together the entire URL that includes all the information to connect to the server, plus username and password. And we implemented a couple things last time we met, right? One that allowed us to retrieve all the blogs, right? We implemented also being able to retrieve a specific blog if we knew their primary key. We didn't get to implement create blog or update or delete. We'll do that today, right? Just to practice. Right? My intention is that after we practice this a few times, right, you'll realize that it's always the same thing. Get a connection, execute a statement, process the result. It's always the same thing, right? And once you identify this pattern, ideally you'll gain confidence, and we can move to even more powerful things. Okay, just when you feel comfortable with something, we'll move on to something else. Anyway, so let's run this, see how this works, right? So let's I'm going to comment this out, and first I'm going to play around with this, finding all the blogs. And so yeah, so this main here is kind of like our application, right? Obviously it's a very limited application. It's not doing very much, right? But any application you would write, right, would basically have to do the same thing, right? You would instantiate the DAO, and once you have the DAO, you can then use the functions that you created, right, to interact with the database. In this case, it's a find all blogs, or create, or update, or remove. These are the 4 or 5 CRUD operations that most tables will require. Right? Obviously, there might be more things that you need to do with the table. Maybe you need to update 2 tables at the same time. Maybe they're related to in one somehow or other. Right? But these are the most basic operations that you would do with any table. So you would always implement these 5 operations all the time, right? For any table that you want to interact with. Yes. So yeah. So let's run this find all blogs. Let's run that. And so we can run it. I guess from here. You can run it from here, or you can say run blog DAO right here. Let's run it here. Run that. So basically, it's going to instantiate the DAO, and it's going to call the find all blogs, and it's going to iterate over the blogs that come back from the database, right? let's see, it's getting a hold of the connection, and it should spew out all the, there we go, right? Here we have all the blogs that we have stored in the database. Yes? If you review the code, right, we'll see that it goes through the common steps, right? First, it instantiates the driver. In our case, it's MySQL driver. Grabs a connection with the URL and the login information, username and password. It creates a statement, executes a SQL statement, and then it processes the results that come back from the database, right? And processing the database, typically it entails mapping the relational world, right, to the object world. And basically what we're doing here is that we're reading from each one of the records, right, each one of the rows that comes back in the result set, reading from each one of the columns, right, from the ID column, from the name column, from the topic column, reading each one of those columns, copying them to local variables that we can then use to populate, right, an object, a blog object, which is the object representation of the relational representation, right? So now you have it representing two places, right? In the record that is stored permanently in the database, and now in a temporary variable, right, that is very ephemeral, right? It's very transient, right? In the object world, you know, objects come and go all the time, right? You know, sometimes we put them in the RAM and then they are blown away from the RAM. But in relational database, right, that's going to be permanently stored until you permanently remove it, right? But until you don't remove it, it's there, right? Always there, occupying some space in some file system. So this blog, we then, you know, appended into some kind of array, right? And then we return the blogs that we had initialized here, and we return that array of blogs which we can then iterate over, right? And then just print them out. Okay. So we also implemented the find blog by ID over here, right? That it can retrieve a single record, right? If you know the ID of that specific record, we can then retrieve that specific record and then just print it out to the console. Okay, and let's see, did it work? I don't know. There it is. Yeah, I printed out SpaceX, right, with a blog whose ID is number 3. And now the implementation is almost identical to what we just did. And the only difference, the big difference really, let's go over it together. Same thing, right? We get the connection, we create the statement, right? We execute the statements, right? And then we have the result set that comes back from the server. Almost identical source code from before. The only difference is that this time around, we know it's a single record, right? We know it's not going to be multiple rows, it's just one of them. So instead of using a while loop, right, we decided to use an if statement, right? That checks on whether we have any rows, right, any records with .next. .next returns true if there are more rows to consume, you know, in particular the first row, right? Before we used the while loop because we knew we were going to have probably more than just one, you know, quite, it could be dozens, right, hundreds, thousands of records, right? Here we know it's only one. Right? I mean, we could have used while loop just the same, right? And just, you know, just know that really it's only one that is coming in here, and we could have rewritten this just with a while loop. But since we know it's one, right, it's preferable and more appropriate that we use the if statement. If there is a record to consume, let's copy over, right, the relational data into our object data, right? And then we just return that blog. Okay, and then we print it out. Make sense? Everybody still okay? Any questions where we are so far? Okay, so let's move on. Let's implement a few other things, right? So we built the read operations. Let's build the update operations, right? We built all the queries, right? Let's build now the updates. Okay, so in particular, let's let's implement maybe a delete blog, right? That should be one of the easier ones. Okay, so let's do that. So in the delete blog, let's implement it in such a way that we're going to need the ID of the blog that we want to remove, right? So if you have the blogs and you know all the IDs, you can pick out one of the IDs and say, oh, okay, I want to remove that one, right? So we'll take that as a parameter. So this will be integer ID. And so let's practice what the steps are to connect to the database, right? Run an update, right? And then process any results. Okay. So the steps are always the same, right? We're going to grab a connection. We need a statement. And here we're going to bring in the MySQL library, right? That the driver, right, that knows how to talk to the actual database. Right? And the way we do that is with class.forName. And the driver, I believe it's called Jdbc driver. It's one of the constants that we declared earlier. This is complaining that this might throw an exception, right? So one of the easiest way to handle this is to just add the exception to the signature. There it is, throws class not found exception, right? If this were a Java course, right, we would spend much more time talking about exceptions and how to properly handle exceptions, but this is not a Java course, right? So we're going to keep that to a minimum, an absolute minimum, right? So we are going to be doing maybe a few shortcuts that normally we would not do if we would be spending more time in learning about Java, but that's not the focus of the course. So we are going to take a couple of liberties, right, so that we can do what we need to do, and learning Java is secondary, right? Really, the focus here is how do we use a programming language, any programming language, right, to talk to a database, right? And let's not have the language get in the way. Okay. All right. So we load the driver, and now we can get a connection. We can say connection from the driver, and so this is the driver manager. We're going to get connection, and the get connection wants to know, well, where's the database running, right? What is the URL or IP address of the server so I can connect to it, right, and create the connection for you? Well, it lives in, I think we created a URL, didn't we? A variable that has a URL, what was it called? DB URL, there it is. We then need to log in. We have to provide any credentials, right? So we have the user variable, and we also have the password variable. So that's going to log us in. This one also throws an exception, right? If it can't find the connections, it would complain saying, oh, I wasn't able to connect. Okay, so I'm going to say we're going to add the exception as well as part of the signature of the delete right there. And okay, now we're connected, hopefully, right? We're connected. We can create a statement so that we can execute any updates or any queries, right? So we'll create a statement. So statement. So from the connection, so create the statement. There it is. And we need the actual SQL statement that we want to send over to the server, right? And the SQL statement will be something like the string, the SQL, right? It'll be, delete from, right, the table blogs, right? And where, right, the ID of the blog is equal to something that we're going to pass here, right? It'll be an integer that we are, so equal, close quote, and then we're going to concatenate at the end the ID of the blog, right? That's being passed as an argument. Okay, so we have the SQL. Now we can run it. We can say statement, right? We'll say dot. Notice we have an execute update. See that? So this is the first time we're going to use an execute update. Up to this point, in both of our finder methods, right, find by ID and find all, we use execute query because it was a select statement, right? But now, because it's either an insert or an update or delete, This is an update to a database, so it's an execute update. See that? Okay. We provide a SQL that has the update statement. Well, not update, right? It's a delete. Delete is an update to the database. And this is going to return a result, not a result set. It's going to return an integer saying whether it's successful or not. Okay. So it'll come back with the number of rows that were affected. Right. So hopefully it'll be just a single row, right? Single record. Because presumably we're removing a blog whose ID we know, it's just that one record. So we're going to return this. We'll return this, and notice that delete blog, we need to change the return type to be an integer for this to work. Okay. All right. So let's before we run this, let's take a look at let's change this code a little bit so that we can know, right, what records we have that we could delete. Right. So let's run this find all blogs so that we know what IDs we could choose from. Right. So let's run that, and let's bring this up a little bit so that we can know which IDs to choose from. And let's see. All right, we got a couple that we can choose. Let's remove this last one over here that we know the ID is 17. Okay, so let's do that before the find all blog so that we can first remove blog number 17, and then we'll print out all the blogs to see if indeed number 17 is no longer there, right? So let's do that. We're going to say dow.delete blog and ID number 17. And then we'll print all of them. Hopefully 17 won't be there anymore. We'll skip from 16 to 22. Okay, so let's run that. All right, there it is. See that? It's skipping, right? Notice that from 16, it jumped to 22. So yeah, so we're able to remove number 17. Okay, everybody good? All right, so let's do something a little more interesting. Let's now create a brand new blog. How's that? Okay, so let's take a look at create blog. So create blog, it's going to take a let's say that we're going to be passing in the information you need to create the blog, right? We'll pass you maybe the name of the blog, and we'll pass you maybe the topic of the blog, okay? Right? And what we're going to do, right, is basically do an insert into the database, right? So let's first grab the driver. So we'll do class.forName. And we have a DB, what was it, JDBC? JDBC driver, there it is. Right, that throws an exception. So again, we're going to just pass the exception over to whoever's calling us to handle that. Now we're going to get the connection. So we're going to say connection from the driver. So driver manager, right, dot get connection from the URL. And DB URL, I think it was called, right? DB URL, I think it was called. Yeah, there it is. We'll pass in the username, user, there we go, and the password. There we go. Okay. This also throws an exception, so we'll lazily just pass the buck to the next guy to handle the exception. We're not going to handle it. And finally, let's grab a statement from the connection, and we're going to create the statement. Now we need the SQL that we're going to use, right? So basically, it'll be some insert. So it'll be some insert into blogs, right? And we'll need to list the columns that we want to insert into. So it'll be the name and the topic, I believe, right? And then the values will be what? Will be some values in here, right? And these values will be what? This name and this topic variables that we're passing in, right? So let's build that. So we'll close this in the two strings. We'll concatenate the name as part of the larger string, and do the same thing here. We'll close the strings and we'll concatenate the topic as part of the larger string. Okay. All right, so we got the insert statement. And so now we can execute the update. We can say statement dot execute update and the SQL. Now this too is going to return an integer that specifies how many records were inserted. In this case, we know it's just one, right? So we can now return this integer, return the integer from the execute, right? And it'll tell us, how many records were ultimately inserted, right? And we'll expect it to be just one. All right, so let's create a brand new blog, right? So here we'll say DAO, create blog, and we can pass the name of the blog. So we'll call it, I don't know, my brand new SpaceX blog, right? And the topic is space. And notice that I don't have that blog here, so hopefully it'll insert a brand new blog with the ID 25. Okay, all right, so let's do that. Let's run this. Oops, looks like there's a bug. I don't see anything highlighted. Okay, let's run it. Let's see if it complains. Okay, that worked. And there it is. There's my brand new SpaceX blog, right, with ID number 25. Okay, everybody good? Can I see your line 25? Line 25, this right here. So line 25 is this one over here. Any particular question? The string SQL, yeah. Yep. Okay, excellent. So let's do one more, right? Again, some practice. It was just truncated from my view. Okay. So let's do an update. So the update over here. So the update is right, can you please explain class.forename again? Yeah, so what class.forename does is that it searches in Java, there's the notion of a class path, right? So a path is just a directory, right? Of from where the Java virtual machine is going to search for classes, right? For all these classes that we're building, that we're creating, right? And so when you compile and when you link, right, it'll search the class path for all the classes so that it can link dynamically at runtime. Okay? And so you can explicitly point out that you want a specific class that is available on the class path that you would like to instantiate, right? And you want to do it at runtime. I don't want to do it at compile time. Instead, I want to do it at runtime. Because at compile time, I can instantiate things using this syntax, right? I can say new and then some class, right? But because these drivers are dependent on by different vendors, I would like to do that at runtime as opposed to at compile time, because I don't know what vendor I might have, right? I want it to be configurable. Right? Sometimes it'll be Oracle, sometimes it'll be MySQL, sometimes a SQL Server. So I want to be able to make it a string, because a string is much more generic. Okay, it's not anything specific. I could put anything in a string, right? So I can, for instance, dynamically configure this and maybe read some configuration file, and the configuration file might tell me what driver to use, right? As opposed to having an actual class. And so I want to be able to do this at runtime. So forename, what it does is that it says, okay, well, instead of you doing new class, I'm going to search the class path for that string, for a class for that string, and I'm going to instantiate it for you, right? So class.forename creates an instance of a class that can be found in the class path, right? And I know Jdbc, when we downloaded MySQL connector, I know that in there, right? The name of the class, that's the name, com.mysql.cj. It's part of the documentation. Yeah, it's declared up here, right? So it dynamically searches for this class in the class path, instantiates it. And when it instantiates it, what it does is that it makes this class available, right? It actually has a value, right? This driver manager that is instantiated by the driver, okay? And the driver might be Oracle, it might be whatever, right? This driver manager knows how to talk to MySQL. If the driver manager would have been an Oracle driver manager, then this driver manager would have known how to get a connection from Oracle, okay? Or from SQL Server, or for whatever vendor, right? So this allows you to dynamically, right, load different drivers, you know, as you try out different vendors, okay? But other than that, you know, other than this line, right, everything else is very generic, right? And it's applicable across any vendor, right? As long as you stay within the boundaries of the Jdbc API, right? You can use this code for any vendor, which is great. You're not dependent on any one vendor, right? That's basically what, you know, Java's selling point is, right? That they don't want you to be dependent on any particular infrastructure. Why didn't you? I know we don't want to do, because again, we don't want to be tied to any specific implementation, right? It is the driver manager that instantiates the underline. And notice the driver manager is not even an instance, right? It's a class. See that? So this method is a static method. See that? And get connection knows to use the driver, right, that was instantiated to get the connection to the vendor, right? So notice that you don't even instantiate driver manager, right? It's a static method on the class itself that knows to use the correct driver, right, to talk to the database. Yeah. All right. So let's do updates. So updates. Let's say that we want to update this particular blog, right? And so we'll need two things. We'll need to know that we want to update a particular blog. We'll need the ID of the blog that we want to update. And we'll need to know also the new values that we want to change, right? We could change maybe the name of the blog. Maybe we can change the topic of the blog. Let's just keep it simple, and let's update just the name of the blog, okay? So first we'll need to know the integer, the ID of the blog that we want to modify, and maybe the new name of the blog. So what we'll do is that same thing as always, right? First, we load the class.for name for the Jdbc driver, right? We'll throw exceptions as well. Here, there it is. Throw the exception, and then we'll get the driver manager to get a hold of the connection. So this would be connection driver manager dot get connection from the DB URL, the user, user and the password, and throw the exception. Now we can do the statement. So statement connection dot create statement. And we'll get a hold of the SQL statement. So it'll be string SQL will be an update. So this will update the blogs table, and we're going to set, right, the name to be equal to the new name, where, right, the ID is equal to the ID. Okay, like that, something like that. For the name, we're going to close the quotes, and then we're going to concatenate in there the new name. There we go. Oops, new name. There we go. Okay. All right. So now we can execute the update, right, using the statement. So statement.execute the update and do the SQL. And we're going to return the results of that, which will be an integer that represents how many records were updated. Okay. All right, so let's try it out. Let's change this blog number 25. Right, we'll change it to we'll change the name. Okay. All right, so let's do this. We're going to, instead of create a new blog, we're going to update a blog. We'll say, DAO. We're going to update the blog, and whose ID is 25, right? And we'll change the name. We'll say, I don't know if you saw the SN10 blew up yesterday. SpaceX SN10 blew up yesterday. So SN10 blew up, after a bumpy landing. And okay, so let's run that, and then we'll see that if number 25 changed, right, change the name. Right, so let's run that. There it is. So you notice that indeed we were able to update it. Okay. All right, excellent. So that really is it, right? JDBC basically, right? It's the few steps. You instantiate you use the class for name to get a hold of the driver. The driver, you get a connection, and you execute a query or an update. If you do a query, you get back a result set, which you can then iterate over, right, and copy over the data over to your object model, right? Or if it's an update, right, you just get back an integer saying how many records were affected, right? And that's it. That's all really JDBC is, right? There are some additional things that are fairly advanced and whatnot, but we're not gonna really get into. Next week we're gonna build an additional layer of abstraction, because JDBC is still very, very low level, right? It's you have to iterate over the code, and it's very cumbersome. There's a lot of little nitty-gritty things that you need to learn about. And so next week we're going to learn about a layer of abstraction that is built on top of JDBC that allows you to think about the database in a much higher level, right? So that you don't have to think about individual rows, individual columns, right? And it's going to allow us to think about the database in terms of objects, okay? But that's we'll talk about that next week. So today, I'd like to discuss the I'd like to discuss what is going to come up soon, right? Of remember that you need to work on a project for this course, and part of working for a project, you'll need to create some kind of way of interacting with the database, right? As opposed to always at the console. Obviously, you can interact with the database at the console, from the command line or from Workbench, but we would like to provide some kind of interaction, some simple user interface. And so I'd like to get you started on that. It's part of a bigger topic, a more general topic of data integration, right? So let's talk about data integration as a broader topic, right? And then we'll focus on as user interfaces as a subtopic or a part of that discussion. Okay, so let's talk about data integration. So we've been working with this single database, and it's fine. I mean, we're learning how to talk to MySQL. Now, when you go out there in industry, you'll start realizing that it's most of the time is not as simple as talking to just one database. It'll often be that you are talking to any number of databases, and with different vendors, and different storage. Some of them will be relational, some of them will be non-relational, and oftentimes you'll find yourself integrating all these disparate systems, right? And so it's a big challenge in industry, and folks are always looking for ways to simplify that integration, right? And now why we have so many different vendors and why our different infrastructure. It's just things change over time, and companies are bought, they are sold, they're integrating, they're merged, right? And oftentimes you end up with a monster of different limbs and legs, and you're like a Frankenstein made up of all sorts of things that of legacy systems that folks, hundreds and thousands of people have been working on projects that are come and gone, they're not there anymore, and then you end up having to maintain all this stuff, right? But it's common that you have you have a plethora of systems that are involved, right? And so there's always a challenge on how is it that you can integrate all these disparate systems, right? You have banks are buying each other all the time, right? And some a previous bank they were using Oracle, and the other one was using MySQL, the other one was using SQL Server, and at the end you have this big bank and you have different divisions and different departments using different databases, and they don't talk to each other, right? And different infrastructure and everything, and people are reading and they're reading on the phone, telling people data and stuff. So that's definitely not very productive. And so we're always looking for ways that we can automate all this integration, right? And so late last century or early this century, there was a lot of interest in how is it that we can integrate these disparate systems, right? And there was a lot of competition amongst the big players on how is it that we can do this, and they were all rushing different standards and different techniques and solutions, but they all settled on certain things that were pretty standard, right? If we are going to share data amongst different vendors and amongst different disparate systems, we have to come up with a common set of things, right? One of them is the protocol, right? What kind of protocol or infrastructure, what is going to be our, what is going to be the highway, right? And by which we're all going to drive on, right? So we all have to agree that, if we're going to have an international standard on driving, everybody has to drive on the right-hand side, right? You can't drive on the left-hand side, or certain things, right? There's going to be speed limits and blah, 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 blah. So first is the protocol, right? On the transfer. How are we going to transfer data across? And a lot of folks, agreed and settled on HTTP as being one of the easiest ways of transferring data across machines, right? The internet had become ubiquitous. People were using HTTP servers for everything, right? For hosting small little tiny websites, to huge corporations using HTTP. So that was one of the things. And the second thing that most of the big players, the Microsofts and the Oracles of the world, they all agree that HTTP as a transport layer, and also they agreed on XML as the way of representing or formatting the data that was going to be transferred between machines, right? Definitely the different vendors internally, right? The databases themselves, they might use some proprietary binary representation of the data when they're transferring data between servers and whatnot, right? But that wasn't gonna fly, right? So they all agreed, let's use some really simple ASCII text format that everybody can parse very easily, and let's encode it using XML. And this lasted for maybe a decade or so, but with the growing exponential growth of web applications, that everybody was rushing to move their all their applications to the web, right? And more and more of the traffic, the data traffic back and forth between web clients and servers that were serving up the data that these clients needed. A lot of the data that was being transferred across was formatted not in XML, but was being formatted as JSON, JavaScript object notation, right? Because the clients were written in JavaScript, and they wanted to consume the data in JSON, not XML. So more and more the formatting of the data evolves over time from primarily XML to now primarily JSON. And today, it's almost like the de facto standard by which these systems exchange data, right, over the internet, over the HTTP, right? So it's very common that any clients that you implement, typically the data representation format will be formatted in JSON format. So that brings us here, right? So say you have this this data that we know how to programmatically retrieve the data from the database, right, using Jdbc. How can we export this or expose this, right, to folks that might want to integrate with our wonderful list of blogs, right? Obviously, our example is trivial and it's laughable, but certainly it could grow into something interesting, and just imagine this would be Ford Motor Company that has all sorts of interactions with all sorts of providers that provide the material, tires and the windshield and the seats and all the instrumentation panel, blah blah blah, and it needs to interact with with dozens, hundreds, thousands of providers, right? Ideally, they want to standardize on the transfer protocol and the formatting of the data, right? So that they're not talking 10 thousands, hundreds or thousands of different ways to different places, right? And so they want to standardize that to smooth the communication and automate this as much as possible. They're also interacting with other folks. There might be interaction with financial institutions. They might be interacting with government agencies with for licensings and whatnot. So they want to there's a lot of pressure to standardize to make the transactions as easily as possible. So anyway, so the standard that we're going to follow is that if people want to get access to the data, typically will be through some HTTP and protocol, and the data will be formatted in JSON. So how would we apply this to this, right? So we have data, we know we can retrieve the data. We want people to access this data, freely access our information, and as we make it available, we can increase the value of the data that we have been capturing for decades, right? Some legacy data that's been sitting in our database, but now if we make it available to everybody, right, we can increase the value of our data. Yes? Right, so how do we do that? Very easily, very simple. What we're going to do is we can very easily wrap this whole class, right, with the following annotation, right? And this is equally easily achievable if you're using C# or using Python or using any other language or infrastructure. There'll be some equivalent mechanism to do something similar. So for instance, here we can say that we can say @ and we can annotate this as a REST controller. Okay, boom, that's it. Now all the data that this DAO can access from the database is now available to the rest of the world, right? We only need to be able to tell, when you retrieve anything through HTTP, in particular through browser, you say HTTP : / yada 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 yada, right? Typically, what you do is that you use some URL, yes, and presumably they'll, the first part of that URL is the server, right, from where that you're retrieving the data from, right? So the first part is the domain name of some server, and then the remainder part of the URL is the physical location of some resource. Yes. So we need to be able to do the same thing here, right? Our resource, right? It's not some website or some HTML or some user interface. Our resource is data, right? The data of the database, right? We want to access that data from the database. So we need to map, right, this URL notice the name, right? URL, right? Universal resource locator, right? Our resource in particular is data, right? So how do you locate the resource? There's a URL. You put a name or a whole bunch of paths and whatnot, right? So we need to be able to put this here and say, okay, well, where's our data? Well, our data can be created. Our data can be created. Our data can be retrieved. It can be read. And so we need to map some URL to these individual resources of data. Right? So let's do that. Now, the most common way of retrieving things in HTTP is by using one of its operators, the get operator, and you can guess what get does, right? It gets data, right? It retrieves data, right? So we're going to annotate this find all blogs using an HTTP get operator and map it to a URL that we can then use to invoke this function, this method, and then get the data. Right, let's do that. We can say get, right, get mapping, there it is, get mapping. So we're going to map it to a URL. So we're going to map this, an incoming get request, right? We're going to map it to the following URL. Right? And this URL is arbitrary, so whatever you want. It would be folders, right? In HTTP, if these were websites, or these would be web pages, these would be folders and files where the resources are these ASCII files, right? Of HTML or CSS or JavaScript. We're not interested in any of that, right? We're interested in data, right? So these are not actually going to be folders, right? They could be mapped to any arbitrary path that you want to provide here, or URL. But I'm going to follow this naming convention. So it's going to find blogs. Okay, find blogs like that. Okay, and there it is, right? So maybe better find all blogs like that. And so we're mapping it to that URL, so that if I run this as a server, right, as an HTTP server, it'll be listening for that incoming HTTP GET request, and it's going to execute that function. Execute that function, which is going to do what? It's going to connect to a database, right? It's going to iterate over a result set. It's going to create an array of blogs, right? And then it's going to return an array of blogs. That's what it does, right? Okay. So what did this function do? It mapped a relational table of records into an object representation of an array, right? And then somehow, magically, we need to map that into a JSON representation, right? That could be interpreted or consumed by some application that is trying to integrate with me. Okay, so let's do that. Let's run this. And I'm not going to run the blog now. Instead, I notice that there's a demo application here. That is my server. That is the HTTP server, right? And we can just right-click on it and just run it. And what this is going to do is going to start up an HTTP server and listen at a particular port. The default port is 8080, port 8080. That's a very common port for developers, right, for testing and developing applications. And there it is, port 8080. And now I have a server listening for incoming HTTP requests. And in particular, that's the one we want to try out. Okay. So if we go out and bring up a browser and we go, HTTP:// and my server is running at port 8080. My local machine, the IP address of my local machine is 127.00.1, and the port is 8080. Right, and then the path is find all blogs. Right? So let's paste that. There it is, find all blogs, and there it is. See that? There's JSON formatted data, right, for our records that lived in the blogs table. Right, they're being transformed into an object-oriented representation of an array in Java, and then again being converted into this ASCII text file right, that contains an array. So you notice the square brackets. Square brackets in the JSON format means this is an array. Also, the curly brackets means that this is an object, which contains several name value pairs, right, where the properties are the keys of this object. And then the values could be integers, could be strings, could be dates, and whatnot. Okay. So there it is, right? So if someone wants to integrate with this data, and this is a very valuable data that I want to share with my partners, right? I just need to tell them that this is a URL that they can come in and look at different things, right? This could be whatever you want it to be, right? This could be purchase orders, right? It could be shopping carts, could be my inventory, it could be whatever, right? And I can now have made it very easy for my partners, right, to integrate with my database, right? That otherwise they would have to, log into my database or do some query or whatever, right? But this allows folks to very easily integrate with me and build very interesting applications, right? This could be a mobile application, right, that is doing a query and then updating some, nifty user interface, or it could be a web application, or it could be a desktop application, right, that is doing this query and then using this to update its user interface. All right, so let's go a little further. And we want to not only retrieve this right, we want to retrieve this, right? But ideally, we would like to be able to do this not necessarily just as a query, as a URL that I need to type at the address bar, right? Ideally, this might be some user interface, some kind of user interface that would allow me to, maybe click on a button or click on something that triggers this query, right? So I'm going to create a very trivial user interface, right, that is going to invoke this same behavior. Okay, let's take a look at that. So let's here, and I'm going to use a web app, but this would be equally. This could be a mobile application, or this could be a desktop application. I'm going to use a web application, just an HTML document, just because it's very trivial to implement and very easy to follow, right? So I'm going to create here a page called blogs, and you can guess what we're going to do in this blog, right? We're going to try and integrate with my application, right? So let's first maybe put a header, blogs, right? So we know that this page is all about blogs. Let's navigate there to make sure that we are in there. So it's same server, but the page is blogs. There we are. So we are in that user interface. Yes. So instead of me typing this, I'm going to copy that, and I'm just going to make a hyperlink. Right? Hyperlink is going to allow me to click on a hyperlink, and then it navigates me to the data. Right. So for instance, I could do something like this. Right, I'm going to just create a small bullet list. I'm going to create a bullet list, and here I'm going to create a hyperlink. Right, I'm going to create a hyperlink, and the URL, right, is going to be, I just pasted that URL that I copied from my browser, right? And you're going to click the button, or the hyperlink is going to be called, find all blogs. Yes, all right. So if we go back and we refresh, we got the hyperlink in there. See that? So now, instead of me having to type this, I can now point my partners to this page. Instead of having to type something, they can click on it, right, and then it navigates them to the data that they might want. Obviously, it looks ugly. We'll talk about later how we can make this prettier. But for now, we know that we have the data available, right? Let's extend this a little further. How about we want to be able to retrieve a specific blog instead of all the blogs, right? Maybe we would want some kind of form, right, where we can type the ID of a specific blog, right? And it can then retrieve that specific blog, right? So let's do that. Let's do that. So let's create another line item here. And we'll create a small little tiny form. So here's a form. Here's a form. And I want to go to the same URL. Go to the same URL, right? So, and the way you do that is through the action. And the URL could be, I'm going to copy this for now, but this is not what I'm going to use. I'm going to paste that in there. Right in here, I could have an input field, right, where I can type an input field, okay, and a button, and a button that allows you to maybe find blog by ID, right, and then now I get an input field, right, I get an input field and a button that allows me to submit this form so that the data can come back, right, for a specific blog, okay? And maybe we can give the user a hint, blog ID. So there's a hint of what I'm expecting you to type in there. And we're also going to name this input field. It's going to go out. And I need to pass you this information that you type in here. And I'm going to call that, I'm going to call this, I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to just call it ID. Okay, this input field, I call it ID, so that when my server receives it, it says, oh, well, I need to know the ID. I'm going to receive the ID that you passed to me, so I can then go fetch the blog that you want. Okay, so, okay, great. We got that. Now we have to decide on the URL. What is it mapped to? Right now, find all blogs is mapped to what? It's mapped to this function. Yes? I want to map my find blog by ID. I want to map it to this function. Yes? Right? So let's create another map, and let's map this function, and we'll call it. These need to be unique. These need to be unique. They can't. It'll be ambiguous, right? If a URL comes in, then, well, which one should execute? This one or that one, right? If it's these need to be unique. So we'll say find blog. How's that? We'll call it just find blog. Yes, find blog. So let's go back to the form and fix that, right? So this will be find blog. All right. Everything okay? All right. So this ID is going to be passed along, right, when we submit this form. So on the other side, I need to grab that ID somehow, right, and map it to this blog ID. So that ID that you passed in that you typed, I need to map it to this integer as an argument, as a parameter. And to do that, we can easily read from that HTTP request that came in from the form. We can read it as a parameter, right? So from the request, right? And the name of the request, the name of the parameter is called ID, right? So we need to read from the request this parameter that is called ID. Well, there's an annotation for that. There's a request parameter. Request param ID. And I'm going to read the ID that came in through the request as a parameter. I'm going to parse it as an integer, and I'm going to pass it to this function, right, as that integer. And then you do your thing. You do whatever you need to do, right, to retrieve that ID. Right? What are you going to do? You're going to connect to a database, a connection, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to do a select statement, yada, yada, yada. Right? I'm going to create a blog object, and I'm going to return you that blog. I'm going to return you that blog, whoever requested it. All right, let's try it out. Let's restart the server. Right. Let's go back. So refresh. Okay, that's not up yet. It's not up. There we go. Okay, so let's try it out. Let's find all the blogs. So let's see. We got blog number 2, blog number 3. So let's try grabbing blog number 3. So let's say 3, find blog by ID. There it is, right? We were able to retrieve that one single blog, okay? Or blog number 4. There it is, Tesla, right? So we can retrieve individual blogs. Awesome. Let's do something more interesting. Let's delete a blog. Let's delete a blog, right? So let's do the same thing here. Grab that. And the button will be delete blog, okay? Delete the blog. And so instead of find blog, I'm going to map it to delete blog. Let's see, is there a question in the chat? It says, what happens if you try to find a blog by an ID that doesn't exist? Yeah, it'll probably return null, right? And it'll read null on the as a string that comes back. Yep. Yeah, so let's delete the blog. I'm same thing. I'm passing an ID, and I'm mapping it to delete blog. So let's go to the delete blog method and map it to delete blog. Right, let's do that. Go blog down, and there's our delete somewhere here. Where's our delete? There's our delete. So we're going to map it to what we said. We're going to map it to /delete blog. Okay, so it says at get mapping delete blog, and we're going to have to read from the request ID param, right? So it says request param the ID. That's going to parse as an integer and pass it as an argument to that function. And it's going to return the integer of how many records were actually removed. All right, so let's try it out. We'll restart the server. And let's refresh. Okay, it's still booting up. There we go. So delete blog. Let's first see a blog, all the blogs. And let's remove maybe this one right here, number 23, right? My new and improved blog. So 23. So let's go back and let's put a 23 in there and let's delete. Notice that it comes back with a 1, meaning there was a record that was removed. We can go back and look at all the blogs and see if 23 is there. Okay, it's no longer there. Notice that it jumps from 22, it jumps to 24. Okay. How about creating a new blog? Let's create a new blog. Right, so let's do that. So here we'll create another form. Oops, there we go. And this will be create blog, and this will be create blog. So create blog. And we'll have 2 fields. How about that? We'll have one for the name of the blog. And this says blog name, maybe, placeholder name. And this will be the topic of the blog. And this is blog topic. Okay. All right. So let's do the same thing as before, right? We're going to map it. We have a create function, don't we? Let's go to the create. I think it's way up here, and we're going to map it to get mapping, and the mapping is create blog, and we're going to read these parameters from the requests, right? So we'll say request parameter name and topic. Yes, right, and it's going to return an integer of how many records were inserted. Okay. All right, let's restart the server. Go back. Let's refresh. There's our create. So here we have, let's create a blog. So this will be blog 333, and topic is cars. Okay, so let's create the blog. It says 1, so presumably it was created. So let's go and find blogs. Let's see, create blog. We go to the bottom. There it is, blog 333 with number 26. See that? And finally, let's do one more. We're going to update the blog, right? So the update blog, right? We're going to create a form that looks very similar. And one will be the ID of the blog that you want to change. So the ID of the blog, blog ID, and we're going to change the name of the blog, right? So we're going to say change blog's name. Okay, and this will be update blog, and so let's map our update function to respond to this incoming request. So let's go back to blog DAO, and our update, I think, is way down here. And delete, update, there we go. So we'll map it to get mapping, update blog, and we'll read here the parameters from the requests, right? So this will be request parameter, and then I think we called it ID, and then we call this name, I believe. Let's verify that. Yeah, ID and name. Oh, all right, excellent. So let's try it out. Let's refresh. Let's reboot our server. Okay, so before we had created a blog 333 over here, right, with ID 26. So let's change it. Let's change and blog 777. Change the blog's name. Okay, it says that it was successful. Let's do a find all the blogs all the way down, and indeed we're able to update it. Okay. So there we have it. We've been able to demonstrate, right, that we can create a very trivial, very crude user interface, right, that can interact remotely with a database, right, that implements the 5 basic operations of retrieving all the records of a table, retrieving an individual record by its primary key, right, creating new data, updating data, or deleting data, right? Those are the most common 5 operations. Obviously, you can create many more operations, right? But those are the 5 basic operations, right? We talked about how to use the low-level API of Jdbc to talk to a database, right? And program that database outside of the database, as opposed to using store procedures and functions and coding it right inside of the database, right? And we saw how we can expose that relational model, right, through an API that folks could use to integrate, right, and build interesting applications that can integrate with data across multiple places, right? That can get data from Barnes and Noble, get data from Best Buy, get data from all sorts of places, right? And create rich applications that integrate and merge all this data to implement really interesting applications, all talking to multiple databases, all integrated by your application. Okay. All right, folks, that's all I had for you. Any questions?
Hi, Professor. I missed the first 5 minutes of class. Is there a way to get the source code from today's class?
Yes, I shared the link as part of the module in Canvas. So if you go to Canvas, right here,
Okay.
there's a link to that repository.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm gonna push this code. Okay, so the terminal, I'm gonna say git add all the code, git commit added controller. I'm gonna push it.
Great, thank you.
All the code is available. All right. All right, folks, if you're watching this on YouTube, if you could please, smash that like button, it really helps. And if nothing else, then I'll see you then.
Thank you. Have a nice weekend.
You too. Take care. Bye-bye.